The Christmas card arrived on Christmas Eve. Inside, beneath the standard printed wish, the names of my children, Mark and Evelyn, were awkwardly scrawled. And a $100 bill, a gesture that was meant to bring warmth instead, left me cold. I, Samuel Brody, 79 years old, a goldsmith who has spent his life working with things whose value is measured in carats and centuries, held in my hands the entirety of their love, valued at $100. They didn't know that upstairs in a velvet box lay 2 gold lockets, their mother's last request. Gifts I was supposed to give them in person, explaining their true, priceless value. But they were too busy. And so I decided that I would teach them one final lesson in the jeweler's art, a lesson in true value. If this story resonated with your soul, click subscribe and let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. I'm truly curious to know where you're tuning in from. The snow began in the late morning, a soft, hesitating fall of flakes that gradually thickened into a silent, determined curtain, erasing the hard edges of the world outside my window. Christmas Eve had always been a day of quiet ritual, but since Eleanor had passed, the quiet had acquired a different texture. It was no longer the peaceful, companionable silence of 2 people who understood each other without words. It was the vast, profound silence of a house holding its breath, waiting for a presence that would never return. My name is Samuel Brody. I am 79 years old, and for more than 50 of those years, my hands have known the patient, unforgiving language of gold and precious stones. I am a goldsmith, a creator of things meant to last, and on this day, my most solemn duty was to the preservation of memory. My first task was the tree. I brought it in from the back porch, a modest fir whose sharp, clean scent of pine and cold air was the first true sign of the holiday to enter the house. I set it up in its usual place in the living room, beside the great window that looked out onto the garden, now a soft, white emptiness. The process was slow, methodical. My joints ached with the cold and the years, but my movements were steady, practiced. After the tree was secure, I went to the attic, to the large cedar chest in the corner under the eaves. Lifting the lid released a sigh of preserved time, the scent of dried cedar, old paper, and the faint, almost imperceptible ghost of Eleanor's lavender sachets. Inside were the boxes, each one labeled in her elegant looping script. Living room ornaments, kitchen wreaths, our first Christmas. I chose the box of ornaments and carried it downstairs as if it were a sacred vessel. In the living room, I sat on the floor beside the tree and began the slow ceremony of unpacking. Each ornament was wrapped in yellowed, fragile tissue paper that rustled like dry leaves. Each one was a key that unlocked a specific room in the house of my memory. The first I unwrapped was a glass bird, its delicate tail spun into a filament of near-invisible thinness. We had bought it at a Christmas market during our honeymoon, and its fragility had always felt like a metaphor for the precious, breakable nature of happiness. Next came the artifacts of our children's pasts, a clumsy, lopsided star fashioned from construction paper and an excess of glitter by a 5-year-old Mark. I held it in my palm, the cheap paper a stark contrast to the noble metals of my trade, yet its value to me was incalculable. I remembered the fierce pride on his small face when he had presented it to us. Then, a small, intricate snowflake, painstakingly beaded onto a wire frame by Evelyn, a testament to a patience I worried she had since lost. I hung them on the branches with a goldsmith's care, finding the perfect position for each one, balancing the weight of memory across the tree. The hours passed in this silent communion. The only sounds were the soft rustle of the tissue paper, the faint clinking of glass, and the steady, resonant ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, a sound that had measured out the entirety of our 52 years together in this house. When all the ornaments were hung, I untangled the string of old-fashioned lights with their large, warm-colored bulbs. As I plugged them in, the tree blinked to life, casting a soft-colored glow across the room, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the still air. It was beautiful, a perfect, glittering monument to a life that felt as distant as the stars. My final ritual for the evening was dinner. I went into the kitchen and prepared the meal Eleanor had always made for Christmas Eve, a slow-roasted duck with cherry sauce. The rich, savory aroma filled the silent house, a cruel trick of the senses, suggesting a celebration that was not to be. I set the dining room table with our best china and polished silver, the plates and cutlery that had witnessed decades of family feasts, of laughter and arguments and clinking glasses. I set 2 places, one for myself, at the head of the table, and one for her, directly opposite. Her empty chair was a silent, accusing presence. I ate my meal slowly, the familiar flavors of bittersweet comfort. I could almost hear her voice, chiding me for using too much salt, her eyes crinkling at the corners in that way she had. The silence of the house pressed in, and each bite was an act of solitary remembrance. After I had cleared the dishes, I did not turn on the television or the radio. I sat in my armchair by the fireplace, the light from the decorated tree painting shifting patterns on the walls. The house was warm, the fire crackled, but the peace I felt was a cold and brittle thing. It was the peace of a museum after closing hours, a place full of beauty and history, but devoid of life. I was the curator of my own past, and tonight, the exhibits were particularly poignant. Christmas morning arrived with a pale, featureless light that reflected off the unbroken blanket of snow, filling the house with a cold, shadowless illumination. The tree in the living room, which had seemed so solemnly beautiful in the firelight of the previous evening, now looked like a lonely, overdressed guest in an empty hall. I moved through my morning rituals with the quiet deliberation of a man who finds solace in order. I made my coffee. I read the paper. I looked out the window at the silent white world. I was not expecting anything to break the stillness. The time for hope had passed with the setting of the sun on Christmas Eve. So when I heard the distant, familiar groan of the mail truck making its way down our unplowed street, I felt nothing but a mild, detached curiosity. The walk to the mailbox at the end of the driveway was a small physical trial. The cold was a living thing, sharp and biting in my lungs, and the snow crunched loudly under my boots, the only sound in the muffled world. The mailbox itself was frigid to the touch, its small metal door stiff with ice. Inside, amongst a few circulars and a utility bill, was a single red envelope. It was aggressively festive, a stark slash of color against the monochrome landscape. I knew what it was instantly. I carried it back to the house, my gloved fingers holding it by a single corner, as if it were a strange and possibly toxic specimen I had discovered. Inside, I did not open it immediately. I placed it on the center of my clean, bare kitchen table, a space that served as my secondary workbench for less intricate tasks. The light from the window over the sink was clear and direct. I sat down and began my examination. The envelope was of a cheap, thin paper, the kind that comes in a bulk box from a pharmacy. The address was printed from a computer, my name and address rendered in a sterile, impersonal font. The postmark was from a city 1,000 miles away, a place I knew only as the location of my son's corporate office. I turned it over. There was no return address, a small but significant omission. It was a message sent from a place, but not from a home. With the precision of a surgeon, I slid my silver letter opener under the flap and sliced it open, a clean, neat incision. The card I slid from the envelope was even more garish than its container. It depicted a cartoonish, winking Santa Claus, his sack overflowing with impossibly shiny presents. The cardstock was glossy and slick, cool to the touch. Inside, a pre-printed message in a swirling, faux calligraphic font wished me, the happiest of holidays and a joyous new year. It was a sentiment manufactured for millions, a product designed to simulate a feeling its sender could not be bothered to articulate. Below the printed text were the signatures. I leaned closer, my goldsmith's eye, trained to spot the slightest imperfection in a setting or a flaw in a stone, now focused on these few strokes of ink. They were rushed. Mark's name was an impatient, angular scrawl, the final K a sharp, dismissive slash. Evelyn's, which had once been a graceful, looping script, was compressed and hurried. They were the signatures of people signing a delivery receipt, not a message to their father. It was an act of obligation, performed with the least possible expenditure of time and thought. Then, something fell from the fold of the card onto the table. It did not flutter. It was too substantial for that. It was a single, crisp, $100 bill. It lay there, flat and green, against the white formica of my kitchen table. I did not pick it up. I simply looked at it. I saw the engraved portrait of Benjamin Franklin, the intricate lattice work, the serial number. It was a perfect specimen of its kind. I had spent my entire life working with value. I understood the enduring, elemental value of gold, a metal born in the heart of a dying star. I understood the value of a diamond, forged by immense pressure and time into a thing of perfect, crystalline permanence. I understood the value of craftsmanship, the hours of patient, focused labor required to turn raw material into an object of beauty and meaning. And laid out before me was my children's assessment of my own value. $100, a transactional solution to a relational problem. It was not a gift. A gift is a thing of thought, of care, of connection. This was a payment, a fee for services not rendered. It was the price of their absence. It was the cost of their convenience. It was an indulgence, paid to themselves, to purchase a Christmas morning free from the guilt of an unmade phone call to their lonely, widowed father. The cold that had been seeping in from the snow-covered world outside was nothing compared to the profound, absolute iciness that spread through my chest. The insult was not in the smallness of the amount, but in the gesture itself. It was a declaration that the bond between us was now a simple matter of commerce, a debt that could be settled with a trivial amount of cash. I finally reached out and picked up the bill. The paper felt thin and insubstantial in my hands, a flimsy, temporary thing. I folded it once with perfect precision and placed it on the table beside the gaudy lying card. It was evidence, and I was, once again, an auditor with a case to build. I left the kitchen, leaving the garish red card and the crisp, insulting banknote lying on the table like the scene of a small, bloodless crime. I walked down the short hallway to the back of the house, to the door that led into my workshop. The moment I stepped across the threshold, the atmosphere changed. The air here was different from the rest of the house. It was not filled with the ghosts of domestic life, but with the clean, sharp scent of possibility. It smelled of metal, of jeweler's rouge, of the faint, oily perfume of well-cared-for machinery. This was my sanctuary, a room where sentiment was a distraction, and precision was the only god. For 55 years, this space had been my refuge, a place where the chaotic, emotional world could be held at bay by the immutable laws of physics and the exacting demands of my craft. I did not immediately go to the safe. Instead, I sat down at my workbench, its heavy wooden surface scarred and stained by decades of focused labor. My hands, which had felt old and unsteady in the kitchen, found their familiar purpose here. I ran my fingers over the neat rows of gravers, their wooden handles worn smooth and dark from the pressure of my palm. I picked up a pair of tweezers, their points so fine they were almost invisible, and tested their tension. I lit the small, precise flame of my annealing torch, its blue and orange hiss the only sound, and watched it burn for a moment before extinguishing it. These were the rituals of my trade, small grounding actions that reconnected me to the core of my identity. I was not just a lonely old man. I was a master craftsman. The insult I had received was an impurity, a piece of slag in the crucible of my life, and I now began to consider, with a professional's cold clarity, how to refine it. My resolve settled, I turned to the heavy black iron safe set into the wall, concealed behind a framed chart of gemstone inclusions. I spun the familiar combination, the clicks of the tumblers a quiet, reassuring countdown. The door swung open, revealing the neatly organized interior where I kept finished pieces, uncut stones, and small bars of pure gold and platinum. From the top shelf, I retrieved a flat, velvet-lined box made of dark cherry wood. It was heavier than it looked. I carried it back to my workbench and placed it directly under the bright, clarifying light of my work lamp. For a moment, I simply looked at the box, its surface polished to a deep, lustrous shine. It contained the last, and most important, work I had ever undertaken for my wife. I lifted the lid. Inside, resting on individual depressions in the deep blue velvet, lay 2 identical lockets. They were fashioned from pure 24-karat gold, a metal too soft for most jewelry, but one I had chosen for its color and its weight, its undeniable and ancient sincerity. The design was one Eleanor and I had sketched out together, simple and elegant, an unadorned, polished oval, heavy and smooth to the touch. The artistry was not on the surface, but in the mechanism. I had spent a month perfecting the concealed hinge and the clasp, a seamless, almost invisible piece of engineering that opened only with a specific, practiced pressure. They were perfect. They were the finest work of my long career. I then returned to the kitchen, retrieved the $100 bill, and brought it back to the workshop. I unfolded it and laid it on the velvet between the 2 lockets. The contrast was obscene. The pure, warm glow of the gold, a noble element born of the cosmos, versus the flat, printed green of the paper, a temporary promise of earthly value. The lockets represented a lifetime of skill, of love, of permanence. The banknote represented 5 minutes of their time. With a jeweler's delicate touch, I picked up the locket engraved with the name Mark on its reverse. I applied the precise pressure, and it sprang open with a soft, satisfying click. I angled it under the light. There, sealed beneath a perfectly cut crystal of clear quartz, was not a jewel, but a small, carefully folded corner of an old, worn $1 bill. A memory, sharp and vivid, rose in my mind. Mark, aged 10, standing on the lawn, his face flushed with sun and pride, holding out the first dollar he had ever earned for mowing our neighbor's lawn. He had been so proud, and I had told him that this single dollar, earned through his own sweat, was worth more than any $100 he might ever be given. Eleanor had saved it. This locket contained the seed of his own potential, the origin point of his ambition, a reminder of a time when the value of money was tied to the dignity of work. I closed it and picked up the second locket, the one bearing Evelyn's name. It opened just as smoothly. Inside, beneath its quartz window, lay a single perfectly preserved forget-me-not flower, its delicate blue petals as vibrant as the day it was picked. Another memory surfaced. Eleanor on her knees in her garden, showing a young Evelyn how the tiny, humble flowers grew in clusters, creating a carpet of impossible blue. She had told her that the most beautiful things in the world were often the most overlooked, that true beauty did not need to be loud or expensive. This locket contained a lesson in perception, a reminder of the simple, enduring beauty that was her birthright, a beauty she had long since abandoned in her chase for the artificial and the admired. I closed the locket. The pain of the insult I had felt in the kitchen was now gone, burned away, and replaced by something far colder and stronger. It was the resolve of a craftsman who sees a beautiful design ignored, a precious material discarded. My children had failed to see the value in their own past, in their own mother's wisdom. They only understood the cold, hard calculus of cash. Very well, I thought. So be it. The plan began to form in my mind, not as a messy outburst of anger, but as a clean, elegant design, a final piece I would craft for them. It would be a lesson, delivered with the precision of a diamond scribe, on the vast, unbridgeable gulf between price and value. The day after Christmas was a day of cold, gray clarity. The manufactured cheer of the holiday had evaporated overnight, leaving the city in a state of weary, commercial exhaustion. Discarded Christmas trees already lay sadly on the curbs, and the festive lights in the shop windows seemed garish and desperate in the flat light of morning. I drove into the city, my old car, a familiar anonymous vessel moving through the slow-moving traffic. My purpose for this journey was a silent, somber one. The plan I had conceived in the solitary heat of my workshop now had to be advanced in the cold, public theater of finance. I was on my way to the bank. The building itself was a monument to a bygone era of commerce, a neoclassical temple with towering marble columns and heavy bronze doors. It was designed to make the individual feel small and the institution feel eternal. As I walked across the vast, echoing lobby, the sound of my footsteps on the polished marble was the only sound that seemed to belong to me. The air was cool and still, carrying the hushed, reverent scent of money, of old paper, and circulated currency. I did not approach the tellers. I walked directly to a small, cordoned-off section of the bank, where a discreet brass plaque read, "Safe Deposit Vault." A young woman in a sharp, dark suit looked up from her computer, her expression one of professional neutrality. I did not speak. I simply slid my identification and the key to my deposit box across the polished granite countertop. She examined my card, then my face, her eyes holding a flicker of bland, institutional recognition. She produced a large, leather-bound ledger and opened it to the correct page. I saw the entry for box number 142. I saw the list of authorized signatures. There were only two, Eleanor Brody and Samuel Brody. Her name was a ghost on the page. The last time she had signed this book, her hand had been frail, but her script still elegant. I picked up the pen and signed my name on the next available line. My own hand was steady, my signature firm, the same precise script I used to sign certificates of authenticity for my work. The young woman blotted the ink, and with a quiet nod, rose and walked toward the vault. I followed. The vault door was a masterpiece of old-world engineering, a perfect, massive circle of polished steel, studded with bolts and locking mechanisms. It swung open with a silent, hydraulic hiss, revealing a brightly lit, sterile world of stainless steel. The air inside was different, colder, drier, recycled and filtered to an unnatural purity. It was the atmosphere of a tomb, a place where precious things were sent to be preserved against the decay of time. We walked down a narrow aisle, the walls a honeycomb of identical numbered steel doors. She stopped before number 142. The ritual of the two keys began. She inserted her long-guarded bank key into one lock. I inserted my small personal key into the other. We turned them in unison. A heavy, satisfying thunk echoed in the small space as the lock disengaged. She pulled open the small steel door, revealing a long, narrow metal box within. She slid it out and handed it to me. It was heavy, its weight familiar and profound. She led me to one of the private viewing rooms, a small windowless cubicle furnished with nothing more than a small table and a single, hard chair. The door clicked shut behind me, leaving me in a state of complete and total privacy. The room was soundproof, a sterile, featureless box designed for the dispassionate examination of wealth. I placed the metal deposit box on the table. For a long moment, I simply sat there, my hands resting on the cool, smooth lid. Inside this box lay the geological record of my marriage, a compressed history told in layers of gold, pearl, and precious stones. Every major milestone, every anniversary, every birthday, every moment of triumph and solace was represented by an object within. To open it felt like a kind of archaeology, a careful excavation of a life that was now over. With a deep breath, I lifted the lid. The contents were nestled in trays lined with faded, dark blue velvet. The harsh, fluorescent light of the viewing room caught the facets of the diamonds and the polished surfaces of the gold, sending shards of cold, brilliant light scattering across the bare walls. It was a breathtaking sight, a pirate's treasure of a deeply personal kind. My eyes, of their own accord, were drawn to a few key pieces. A pearl necklace, its luster as soft and luminous as moonlight. I remembered the night of our 25th anniversary, the way the pearls had glowed against the dark velvet of Eleanor's dress. A pair of sapphire earrings, the color of a deep twilight sky. A gift to her after the difficult birth of our son, Mark. She had said they reminded her of his newborn eyes. An emerald brooch, intricate and bold. A piece she had bought for herself to celebrate a promotion, a symbol of her own quiet strength. The memories rose up, sharp and powerful, threatening to flood the sterile room with an unwieldy and dangerous sentiment. I closed my eyes for a second, and then I opened them again, my focus deliberately shifting. I was no longer a husband remembering his wife. I was a goldsmith assessing his inventory. I began the work, my mind cold and clear. I mentally catalogued each piece, my professional eye noting the quality of the settings, the carat weight of the stones, the market value of the gold. I was translating love into a number, converting a history into an asset. The process was a brutal act of internal discipline. When I was finished, I closed the lid of the box, the beautiful cold fire of the gems once more hidden in the dark. My purpose for this visit was complete. I had faced the memories, and I had converted them in my own mind into a column on a ledger. I slid the box back into its steel drawer, locked it with my key, and walked out of the vault, out of the bank, and back into the gray, uncaring light of the city. The plan was now in motion. The journey from the bank back to my workshop was a silent, somber procession. The long metal box, buckled securely into the passenger seat of my car, was no longer just a repository of memory. It was now the raw material for the most difficult project of my life. In my workshop, I did not immediately open it. First, I prepared the space. This was not to be a work of creation, of coaxing beauty from inert metal, but a work of deconstruction. I cleared my primary workbench of all the familiar, comfortable clutter of ongoing projects. I wiped its surface clean, then unrolled a large, fresh jeweler's mat of dark gray velvet, its pristine, unmarked surface a sterile field upon which the dissection would take place. I arranged my tools, not the hammers and torches of a goldsmith, but the cold, analytical instruments of a gemologist. I laid out my digital gram scale, my set of master stones for color grading, my refractometer, and my binocular microscope, its brass and black enamel body gleaming under the focused beam of my work lamp. I was not an artist today. I was a coroner. I placed the metal box on the bench and lifted the lid. The jewelry, which had seemed so brilliant and alive in the bank's sterile viewing room, now looked like a collection of beautiful, sleeping things under the intense, direct light of my lamp. I began the appraisal. My own rule, in all my professional life, was to begin with the most difficult piece, to confront the greatest challenge head-on. I reached into the box, and my fingers, of their own accord, found the small velvet ring box that held Eleanor's engagement ring. I placed it on the mat. For a long moment, I could only look at it, the memories associated with it as brilliant and sharp as the diamond it held. The proposal, on a rainy afternoon, the way her hand had trembled as I slid it onto her finger. It was the foundational artifact of our entire life together. I took a deep, steadying breath, picked up my loupe, and placed it in my eye. The world outside the small circular lens vanished. The emotional weight of the object was gone, replaced by the technical details of its construction. It became item Lars Urzo 1. I began the ritual. First, the metal. I examined the platinum setting, noting the maker's mark, my own, a stylized SB, and the purity stamp. The band was worn, covered in a patina of fine scratches, a physical record of 52 years of constant wear. To a buyer, they were imperfections. To me, they were the story. I ignored the story. I noted the condition as good, commensurate with age. Then, the stone. I held it in my tweezers, turning it slowly, letting the light play through its facets. The cut was a little old-fashioned, not as mathematically perfect as the computer-designed cuts of today, but it had fire and life. Under the microscope, I found the single, tiny, feather-like inclusion that made it a VVS1 clarity grade instead of flawless. I remembered discovering that inclusion when I first bought the stone, a small secret signature from the earth itself. I recorded the data in a new, heavy ledger I had opened for this task. My handwriting was small, precise, and devoid of emotion. Item Sarvozos 1, engagement ring, platinum 950, 5.6 grams, center stone, diamond, 1.02 carats, round brilliant cut, color G, clarity VVS1. The ring was no longer a symbol of my love. It was a set of statistics. I moved on, piece by piece, falling into the deep, focused rhythm of the work. I picked up the sapphire earrings. As the deep, velvety blue of the stones filled the lens of my loupe, a memory broke through my defenses. Eleanor in the hospital bed, exhausted but radiant after Mark's birth, her ears adorned with these new drops of blue, a match for our son's eyes. My hand faltered for a second. The tweezers slipped. I put them down, removed the loupe from my eye, and sat back, my heart aching with a sudden, sharp pain. The past was not dead. It was merely dormant, and each of these objects was a key to its awakening. I took another breath, held it, and let it out slowly. I was a professional. I had a job to do. I placed the loupe back in my eye and returned to the task, forcing my mind to focus on the technical. I noted the zoning in the sapphires, the quality of the silk, the telltale signs of their salon origin. I recorded the data. I moved to the next piece. The work continued for days. The sun would rise and set outside my workshop window, and I would barely notice. The pile of appraised items, each now sealed in a small numbered plastic bag, grew steadily. The pages of my ledger filled with the cold, hard language of my trade. I was creating the most comprehensive and the most heartbreaking catalog of my life. I appraised the pearl necklace, noting the thickness of the nacre and the quality of the luster, ignoring the memory of our anniversary dinner. I appraised the ruby bracelet, documenting the color and origin of each stone, ignoring the memory of a long-ago Valentine's Day. Near the end of the collection, I came across the small, diamond-dusted swallow brooch. It was a piece of antique costume jewelry, not particularly valuable by market standards. The diamonds were small, single-cut chips, the metal a lesser grade of gold. It was the piece Eleanor had bought for herself with her first paycheck, a symbol of her own independence before she was a wife or a mother. My children, with their untrained eyes, would have dismissed it as trivial. But I examined it with the same care as I had the large diamond. I noted the craftsmanship of the millgrain setting, the charm of the old-fashioned design. In my ledger, its monetary value was a fraction of the other pieces, but I made a small private note for myself beside the entry. Priceless. This was the heart of the lesson. The things they would overlook, the things they could not quantify in dollars, were the very things that held the most value. When the final piece was appraised and catalogued, I looked at the scene before me. The velvet-lined box was empty. My workbench was covered in a neat, orderly grid of small plastic bags. The ledger was full. I had successfully converted a life of shared love into a list of assets. The transformation was complete. With the appraisal complete, the ledger book on my workbench was now a finished and closed text. It was the financial biography of my marriage, and its final chapter was yet to be written. The next step in my plan required moving these objects, these vessels of memory, from the sacred space of my workshop into the profane world of commerce. The act of selling them was, in itself, a crucial part of the lesson I intended to teach. The liquidation had to be as professional, as cold, and as ruthlessly efficient as the insult my children had delivered. I would not take these pieces to a local pawn shop or a neighborhood jeweler. That would have been a small, petty act. No, this collection, Eleanor's legacy, deserved a final, grand stage before it was dissolved into the anonymity of cash. I spent an evening researching, not in my old reference books, but on the laptop that now felt like a familiar tool. I bypassed the loud, aggressive websites of online gold buyers and looked instead at the discreet, venerable names of the world's finest auction houses. I found the one I was looking for, a firm in New York with a long history of handling significant estate collections with professionalism and discretion. Their reputation was impeccable. In the cold digital light of the screen, I composed a formal inquiry. I did not write as a grieving husband, but as a potential consignor. I attached a digitized, password-protected version of my catalog, complete with high-resolution photographs I had taken of each piece. My message was brief, professional, and to the point. I sent it into the ether and shut the laptop. The reply came less than 24 hours later. It was equally professional, expressing significant interest and proposing that one of their senior specialists visit me personally to inspect the collection and arrange for its secure transport. We arranged a date. The intervening days were quiet. The jewelry remained on my workbench, each piece in its small numbered bag, a silent, glittering army awaiting its final orders. I did not touch them. I had already said my goodbyes during the appraisal. To handle them now would be to risk reopening a wound I had carefully cauterized. The specialist arrived on a Tuesday morning. He was a young man, perhaps in his early 30s, dressed in a perfectly tailored gray suit, his face a pleasant but unreadable mask of professional poise. He carried a slim aluminum briefcase. He did not offer a hand to shake, but a slight, respectful bow of the head, a gesture I appreciated for its formal distance. I led him to my workshop. He stepped inside, and his eyes, sharp and practiced, did a quick, comprehensive sweep of the room, taking in the tools, the lighting, and the security of the space before they landed on the collection laid out on my workbench. I saw a flicker of genuine, professional admiration in his gaze as he took in the quality and scope of the pieces. He placed his briefcase on a small side table and opened it. From within, he produced a pair of white cotton gloves, which he put on with the care of a surgeon. He also laid out his own loupe and a small portable spectrometer. He was not here to take my word for anything. He was here to verify. I gestured for him to begin, and then I stepped back, taking a seat on a stool in the corner of the room, becoming a silent observer of my own life's dismantling. He worked with a quiet, focused efficiency that I, as a fellow craftsman, could not help but admire. He picked up the first bag, item Daiguerreau 1, Eleanor's engagement ring. He slid it from its plastic enclosure and placed it on the velvet mat. For the next 10 minutes, he examined it, comparing it to the entry in my catalog which I had printed for him. He weighed it, measured its dimensions, and spent a long time looking at the diamond through his loupe. He was not seeing a 50-year promise. He was seeing a G-color, VVS1 clarity stone, and nodding in professional satisfaction at the accuracy of my grading. He moved through the collection, piece by piece. I watched his gloved fingers, so alien and impersonal, handle the sapphire earrings, the ruby bracelet, the intricate gold work of a necklace I had spent 100 hours creating. He was touching the physical embodiment of my most cherished memories, but for him, they were merely lots in an upcoming sale, assets to be catalogued and sold to the highest bidder. As he picked up the long strand of pearls, a memory, unbidden and powerful, broke through my carefully constructed defenses. I saw Eleanor, dressed for an opera, standing in front of the hall mirror. I was clasping the cool, smooth pearls around her neck, my fingers brushing against her skin. She had turned and smiled at me in the mirror, her eyes full of a light that no gemstone could ever replicate. The memory was so vivid, so complete, that I felt a physical jolt, a sudden sharp intake of breath. The young man glanced up at me, his expression momentarily questioning. I composed my features into a neutral mask and gave a slight, dismissive wave of my hand, as if I had merely been clearing my throat. He returned to his work. When he had inspected the final piece, the little swallow brooch, he looked up and gave me a single confirming nod. My catalog was perfect. He produced a multi-page consignment contract from his briefcase and handed it to me. I read every line of the dense legal text. It detailed the auction house's commission, the insurance values, the proposed auction date. It was the formal legal document that would transform my wife's legacy into a commodity. I took my fountain pen and signed my name on the final page. My signature was firm. I slid the contract back to him. The transaction was complete. He then began the final, solemn task of packing the collection. From his case, he produced a set of precision-cut foam inserts. Each piece of jewelry was placed into its own snug compartment. The engagement ring vanished into a small, dark square. The pearls were coiled into a circular cutout. One by one, the bright, glittering pieces of my past disappeared into the dark, protective foam. When the last piece was packed, he closed the lid of the case. The sound of the heavy latches clicking shut was a sound of absolute, irrevocable finality. He stood, picked up the case, gave me another slight bow, and walked out of my workshop. I followed him to the front door and watched as he drove away, the sum total of my marriage resting in a small, secure case on the passenger seat of his car. The house, when I closed the door, felt vast, hollow, and profoundly empty. With the vast, glittering bulk of Eleanor's collection gone, my workshop felt cleansed, pared down to its essential purpose. The benches were clear, the tools silent. The transaction with the auction house had been a necessary amputation, a painful severing of the past in order to save the integrity of its memory. What remained was not a collection, but a purpose. Resting alone in the center of the gray velvet mat on my workbench was the dark cherrywood box, and inside it, the 2 gold lockets. This was the part of my plan that required not the cold eye of the appraiser, but the steady hand of the craftsman and the quiet heart of the husband who had made a final promise. This was the preparation of the true inheritance. I opened the box. The twin ovals of pure gold seemed to absorb the light in the room, glowing with a soft, warm luster that felt ancient and profound. They were the last physical objects imbued with the pure, unadulterated intent of my love for Eleanor and the children we had raised. My first task was a final, loving inspection. I picked up Mark's locket, its weight solid and reassuring in my palm. With a soft chamois cloth, the same kind I used for the final polish on my finest work, I gently buffed the surface, erasing any trace of my own fingerprints, bringing the mirror finish to a state of flawless perfection. I tested the secret clasp, a mechanism I had designed to be almost invisible, a small section of the bezel that required a specific, knowing pressure. It opened with a soft, satisfying whisper of perfectly fitted metal. I did the same for Evelyn's, my movements a slow, reverent ritual. Then I turned to the contents, the seemingly worthless trifles that were the heart of this entire, painful exercise. From a small acid-free envelope where it had been kept for almost 30 years, I carefully removed the corner of the $1 bill, Mark's first earning. The paper was soft, almost cloth-like with age. The green ink faded. I remembered the day he had earned it with a clarity that defied the intervening decades. The smell of cut grass, the whine of the neighbor's lawnmower, the way Mark had stood before me. His small chest puffed out with a pride so fierce and pure it was almost painful to witness. Using a pair of fine, flat-nosed tweezers, I positioned the folded corner onto the small silk bed inside his locket. I then took the rock crystal lens I had custom cut for it, its edges beveled to fit perfectly, and sealed the compartment. The crystal acted as a magnifier, making the frayed fibers of the old bill and the faded portrait of Washington seem like a sacred relic. It was a monument to a moment of perfect, uncorrupted self-worth, a moment my son had long since forgotten. Next, I prepared Evelyn's inheritance. The small dried forget-me-not was impossibly fragile, a whisper of a flower preserved from one of Eleanor's last summers. I handled it with the utmost care, my breath held, my movements slow. I remembered my wife in her garden, her hands deep in the dark, rich soil, a simple straw hat on her head. She had a way with growing things, a patient, nurturing spirit that I had always admired. She had taught Evelyn the names of all the flowers, but the forget-me-nots had been her favorites. They prove that the most beautiful things, she had told our daughter, never shout for your attention. I placed the tiny, perfect flower into its golden receptacle and sealed it under its crystal window. It lay there, a splash of pale, eternal blue against the dark silk, a quiet testament to a philosophy of beauty my daughter had traded for the loud, fleeting admiration of strangers. With the lockets complete, I turned to the final component, the message. It could not be an explanation. It had to be a question, a quiet seed of doubt planted in the barren soil of their certainty. I took out 2 small cards of heavy cream-colored cotton paper, the kind I used for certificates of authenticity. I uncapped my oldest fountain pen, the one with a flexible nib that knew the exact pressure of my hand. I filled it with fresh black ink. Then, with the focused precision of a master engraver, I wrote the 6 words Eleanor had loved. I treated each letter as a work of art, with swelling downstrokes and hairline upstrokes, the ink settling into the fine texture of the paper. The most valuable things have no price. I wrote it once. Then, on the second card, I wrote it again. I did not sign them. The words belonged to their mother, and it was her ghost who would deliver this final message. The final stage was the packaging. This, too, was a part of the message. I placed each locket into a heavy, velvet-lined jeweler's box, the kind that opens with a soft, spring-loaded hiss. I placed a folded card inside each one. The presentation was designed to scream value in the only language they understood. The weight of the box, the quality of the velvet, the gleam of the gold, it would all build a powerful sense of anticipation. Then I placed these luxurious boxes inside 2 plain, anonymous cardboard shipping containers, surrounding them with packing material. The outer shell was deliberately unremarkable, giving no clue as to the treasure or the puzzle that lay within. I sealed the boxes with brown packing tape, the sound of the tape dispenser loud and final in the quiet workshop. I wrote their names and addresses on the plain white labels in a simple block script. I left the space for the return address completely blank. The 2 packages now sat on my workbench, mute and unassuming. They were no longer gifts. They were messengers, dispatched on a mission of quiet, psychological warfare. They were time capsules, filled with a past my children had discarded, sent to disrupt a future they had so carefully planned. The final number arrived not as a dramatic announcement, but as a quiet line of text on my computer screen. It was an email from the auction house, a formal and impersonal confirmation that the wire transfer had been completed. Below the text was a link to a secure portal. I clicked it, and a bank statement materialized on the screen, the letterhead of a temporary holding account bearing my name. And there it was, a single credit entry, a long, formidable string of digits followed by a decimal point and 2 zeros. This number was the sum total of 50 years of love and life, of anniversaries and birthdays, of private jokes and shared sorrows, all rendered down, smelted, and purified into its final, transactional form. I looked at the figure for a long time, not with sadness, but with the dispassionate eye of a craftsman examining his raw material. The value of Eleanor's collection had been established. Now, it was time to forge it into its final shape. I did not go to my local bank, the one where the tellers knew my name and asked about my health. This was not a personal transaction. This was a clinical, strategic maneuver, and it required an appropriately sterile venue. I drove downtown to the financial district, to a towering glass and steel skyscraper that housed the regional headquarters of a large national commercial bank. The lobby was a cathedral of modern capitalism, a vast, echoing space of polished granite and brushed steel. The people here moved with a hurried, sharp-edged purpose, their faces illuminated by the glow of their phones. I was an anachronism in this place, an old man in a tweed coat, moving at a slower, more deliberate pace. I was invisible, and that was precisely what I wanted. I had made an appointment. A woman with a title, Vice President of Philanthropic Services, greeted me not with a handshake, but with a polite, efficient nod, and led me to a glass-walled office that overlooked the bustling city below. The office was minimalist, cold, furnished with designer chairs that were more beautiful than comfortable. She sat opposite me at a large glass desk, her hands folded, her expression one of polite, professional inquiry. I did not speak. I opened my briefcase and began to lay out my documents on the desk between us, creating a silent, logical progression of intent. First, I presented the printout of the bank statement from the holding account, the evidence of the funds. I tapped my finger on the final balance. Her eyes widened slightly as she registered the amount, her professional poise momentarily flickering. Next, I pushed a second document across the desk. It was a formal letter of instruction, which I had typed and signed that morning. The letter was simple, clear, and legally precise. It instructed her bank to act as my agent in drawing a single cashier's check for the full and exact amount listed on the statement I had just shown her. I had already provided the necessary account numbers and transfer authorizations. Her eyes scanned the document. She nodded, understanding the mechanics of the transaction. Then I slid a third, and final, document across the glass. This was another letter, this one addressed to the Chief Financial Officer of the Children's Hospital Foundation. This was the instruction that contained the soul of my plan. I watched her face as she read it. I saw her professional calm dissolve into genuine, undisguised surprise. The letter detailed the terms of an irrevocable, one-time donation. It specified that the entirety of the funds were to be used for the sole purpose of creating a new wing in the hospital, to be named the Eleanor Brodie Memorial Library. And then came the crucial clause, the one that turned this act of charity into a perfectly calibrated weapon. The letter stipulated that the donation was to be publicly credited, in all press releases and on all permanent plaques, not to me, but to my children. Mark Brodie and Evelyn Brodie, in loving memory of their mother. She read the letter twice, her lips slightly parted in disbelief. She looked up at me, her eyes full of questions she was too professional to ask. I simply met her gaze, my own expression offering no explanation. I gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, a silent confirmation. Proceed. The transaction itself was an anticlimax, a series of quiet clicks on a computer keyboard. She swiveled in her chair, her back to me, and began the process. I looked out the window of her high-rise office, down at the anonymous flow of traffic on the streets below. I thought of Eleanor, of her quiet afternoons spent in the hospital, reading stories to children whose names she never knew. She never sought recognition. She believed that an act of kindness was its own reward. What I was doing now felt like a perversion of that beautiful, simple philosophy, and yet it also felt like its ultimate fulfillment. I was taking the empty, glittering symbols of wealth that my children worshipped and transforming them into something of real, tangible, and lasting value, something that would bring comfort and joy to children in need. I was honoring my wife's spirit in a way that would force my children to publicly confront the very values they had abandoned. This was the turning point, the moment the potential energy of my plan was converted into an unstoppable kinetic force. The woman at the desk turned back toward me. On her printer, a large, official-looking check was slowly emerging. She took it, inspected it, and then stamped it with a heavy, satisfying thud of authority. She signed it, her own signature a guarantee of the bank's authority. The money was no longer mine. It had been transformed, sent on a journey to its final destination. She slid the check into a thick courier envelope, addressed it to the hospital, and placed it in an outgoing mail tray on her desk. My hands were empty. I had walked into the bank with the monetary equivalent of my past, and I was walking out with nothing but the quiet, grim satisfaction of a perfectly executed move. I stood, gave her the same slight bow she had given me, and left the office. As I walked out of the bank and back into the cold city air, I felt a strange sense of lightness. The burden of that inheritance and the painful memories attached to it was gone. I had set a great and terrible machine in motion. All that was left to do was wait for its gears to turn. The 2 packages sat on my workbench for a full day, 2 small, unassuming brown boxes that contained the last echoes of my wife's hope and the full cold weight of my own judgment. They were the final pieces in the complex mechanism I had constructed. The great gears of the financial part of my plan were already turning, irrevocably, in the world of banks and boardrooms. These small packages were the intimate, personal component, the quiet, piercing notes in what was otherwise a loud and public reckoning. The morning after the donation, I awoke with a sense of clear, unhurried purpose. It was time to release them into the world. I did not take them to my local post office, the small familiar building where the clerks knew my face. This was a mission that required anonymity. I drove to a neighboring town, to a large impersonal postal hub I had never visited before, a place where I would be just another old man mailing a package. The interior of the post office was a study in mundane bureaucracy. The air smelled of ink and old paper, and the floor was scuffed with the passage of 1,000 hurried feet. I stood in line behind a young mother, mailing a care package to her college-aged son, and a small business owner shipping out orders. They were engaged in the simple, ordinary commerce of life, their packages filled with cookies, sweaters, and handmade goods. My own parcels felt alien in this context, like 2 small, ingeniously designed bombs disguised as gifts. When my turn came, I placed the 2 boxes on the cold, stainless steel scale. The clerk, a woman with a tired, impassive face, barely glanced at me. To her, they were just 2 more items in an endless stream, defined only by their weight and their destination. I made my requests with a series of simple gestures, pointing to the options for insurance and tracking on the form. I wanted them to be treated as valuable, to be accounted for at every step of their journey. I paid for the substantial postage in cash, counting out the bills from my wallet, leaving no electronic trail. The clerk worked with a bored efficiency, her hands a blur as she affixed the complex latticework of labels and postage to the boxes. She stamped them with a loud, percussive thud, a sound of official bureaucratic finality. She pushed 2 small receipts across the counter toward me. I took them, folded them neatly, and placed them in my pocket. I watched her toss the 2 packages into a large canvas bin behind her, where they disappeared among dozens of others. They were no longer in my possession. They had been absorbed into the vast, indifferent circulatory system of the mail. 2 small coded messages sent out into the world. During the long, quiet drive home, and in the days that followed, my mind was occupied by the journey of those 2 small boxes. I would sit in my workshop and visualize their progress, my thoughts tracking them more accurately than any website. I saw them on rumbling conveyor belts in vast, cavernous sorting facilities, jostled among countless other packages. I imagined them in the dark, roaring belly of a cargo plane, crossing the country at night while their intended recipients slept in their comfortable, unexamined lives. These objects, born of such specific, intimate love, were now just anonymous cargo, their true nature and purpose utterly unknown to the system that was carrying them. My imagination, honed by a lifetime of visualizing complex designs in 3 dimensions, then turned to their arrival. I pictured a uniformed courier walking up the long, manicured driveway of my son's modern, glass and steel house. I saw Mark, home from his office, taking the box with a look of mild, impatient curiosity. I saw him slice it open with a letter opener from his expensive desk set, his movements efficient and precise. I visualized the moment he would see the velvet jeweler's box, the way a flicker of genuine, avaricious interest would cross his features. An unexpected dividend, he might think, a gift from an admiring client. Then I saw him opening the locket. I saw his brow furrow as he took in the heavy, solid gold. And then, the final reveal. The small sealed compartment, the worthless scrap of an old dollar bill. I pictured his face in perfect, high-fidelity detail. The initial confusion, the quick, angry search for a hidden cache of gems, the dawning, frustrating realization that this was all there was. I saw him turning the object over and over in his hands, a thing of obvious material value containing something of absolutely no value to him, a perfect and infuriating paradox. I did the same for my daughter. I saw the package left on the wide, welcoming porch of her sprawling colonial home. I saw her discovering it, her delight at an unexpected, anonymous gift. She would open it in her living room, a room decorated with a professional's eye for expensive, impersonal beauty. She too would feel the thrill of anticipation at the sight of the velvet box. She would imagine a diamond bracelet, perhaps, or sapphire earrings from a secret admirer. I saw her delicate, manicured fingers opening the locket, her smile of expectation slowly freezing and then dissolving into a mask of pure, disdainful confusion. The dried, faded flower, a piece of dead foliage. To her, it would be an insult, a piece of trash set in a beautiful frame. She would see no beauty in it, no history, no meaning. She would only see the baffling, pointless gesture. I pictured both of them, in their separate, luxurious homes 1,000 miles apart, holding these objects of their mother's deepest love, and seeing nothing. I saw them finding the small calligraphed cards, reading the 6 simple words, and feeling not a pang of recognition, but a fresh wave of irritation at the nonsensical, sentimental message. The messengers had been dispatched. The seeds of confusion had been sown. I sat in my quiet house, the 2 small tracking receipts laid out on my desk, like trophies from a silent, victorious campaign, and I waited for the rest of my design to unfold. The tracking receipts sat on my desk like 2 finalized contracts, the last tangible link to the messengers I had dispatched. For 2 days, I monitored their progress, the cold clinical updates on the Postal Service website tracing their path across the country. I watched the status of each small package change from in transit to out for delivery, and finally, to delivered. The first was delivered on a Tuesday morning to a sprawling, manicured estate in the South. The second on a Wednesday afternoon to a sleek architectural home on the West Coast. I imagined the boxes sitting on their respective doorsteps, two small brown Trojan horses, their contents a silent, baffling puzzle. The private, psychological component of my plan had been deployed. Now, all my attention turned to the final, public act. My workshop once again became an intelligence center, but my focus was no longer on the past, but on the immediate future. The laptop became my sole tool. I was no longer a historian of my children's failures. I was a strategist, conducting reconnaissance on their current lives to ensure the final blow would land with the most devastating possible impact. Timing, in both jewelry making and in matters of justice, is everything. A clumsy, ill-timed move could ruin the entire design. I began with my son. I immersed myself in the digital world of his career. I read articles in business journals that mentioned his name. I scanned the corporate website of the firm where he was a senior partner. I studied the online profiles of his colleagues and competitors. A pattern of ambition and precariousness emerged. A series of small news items revealed that his firm was in the final stages of a major merger, and his name was being mentioned as a likely candidate to lead a new, expanded division. It was the culmination of his life's work, a position that would depend not just on his performance, but on his reputation as a stable, respectable, and morally upright leader. I found the date of the final board meeting where the decision would be announced. It was 10 days away. Next, I turned my attention to my daughter. Her world was not one of corporate boardrooms, but of charity galas, country club committees, and the carefully curated stage of high society. Her life, too, was a public performance, and I began to study its calendar. I found the website for the city's art museum, where she sat on the acquisitions committee. Their annual benefit, the most important social event of the season, was scheduled in 2 weeks. I found her name listed prominently on the event's webpage, not just as a guest, but as a co-chair of the host committee. Her photograph, a professional and flawless portrait, smiled out from the screen. Her success in that world was measured in visibility, in the perception of effortless grace and magnanimous generosity. Her position as co-chair was a social coup, a platform from which to cement her status among the city's elite. I now had my timeline, a critical 2-week period during which my son's professional future and my daughter's social triumph would hang in a delicate balance, both utterly dependent on their public image. The announcement of their unprecedented and humble philanthropic gesture had to be made within this window. A random press release was not enough. It had to be a significant cultural event in itself, a story that would be impossible for their respective circles to ignore. The perfect vehicle, I knew, was the Sunday edition of the city's most respected newspaper, whose society and philanthropy section was the official record of the lives and good deeds of the wealthy. With my strategy finalized, I made the last necessary phone call. I did not call as myself. I called the public relations office of the Children's Hospital Foundation, introducing myself in a low, formal tone as a representative of the private financial office that had facilitated the Brody family's recent donation. The voice on the other end, a bright, energetic young woman, was immediately effusive with gratitude. I let her speak for a moment before gently interrupting. I explained that while the donors, Mark and Evelyn Brody, were exceptionally private and humble people, the original benefactor who had arranged the donation felt strongly that the story of their generosity should be used to inspire others. I was merely an executor of this wish. I then, with a tone of casual, professional suggestion, floated the idea. I spoke of the power of a well-placed story, the prestige of the Sunday paper, the way a feature in the society section could elevate the hospital's profile and encourage a new wave of year-end giving from the city's most affluent citizens. I was not giving an order. I was offering a strategic media consultation. The young woman embraced the idea with unrestrained enthusiasm. It was a publicist's dream. She thanked me profusely for the brilliant suggestion and assured me she would contact her editor at the paper immediately. She promised it would be a beautiful, prominent feature. We settled on the upcoming Sunday, a date that fell perfectly, precisely in the middle of my chosen 2-week window. The final stage was now set, the curtain time established. My part in the orchestration was complete. I hung up the phone. I had aimed my weapon not at my children's bank accounts, which were already empty, but at the one thing they still possessed and valued above all else, their carefully constructed public image. I had loaded it with the ammunition of their mother's legacy and their own hypocrisy, and I had just set the timing mechanism. All that was left to do was to wait for the inevitable, glorious, and devastating explosion. The world outside my window on Sunday morning was quiet, holding the particular stillness that only comes on the day of rest. I had woken before the dawn, as was my custom, and had sat in the dark, sipping my coffee, not in a state of nervous anticipation, but in one of quiet, final observation. I was a watchmaker, waiting for the precisely calibrated hands of a great clock to align and strike the appointed hour. The gentle thud of the newspaper landing on my front porch was the first chime. I did not hurry to retrieve it. I finished my coffee, rinsed the cup, and placed it in the drying rack. My movements were unhurried, deliberate. The news inside that plastic-wrapped bundle of paper was not news to me. It was the final, published proof of a design I had completed weeks ago. I brought the thick, heavy paper inside and laid it on the polished surface of my dining room table. The light from the large window illuminated the front page, with its bold headlines about world events and political squabbles, the loud, ephemeral noise of the present moment. I ignored it all. With the care of a scholar handling a rare manuscript, I began to separate the sections, my fingers searching for the thick, glossy pages of the Society and Philanthropy Review. I found it tucked between the travel and automotive sections, and there it was, on the front page of the section, below the fold, but occupying a significant and unmissable portion of the layout. The headline was larger than I had anticipated, written in a warm, elegant font. A Legacy of Love, Brody Heirs. Honor Mother with Landmark Gift to Children's Hospital. Beneath it was not a photograph of my children, a choice of subtle genius on the part of the hospital's public relations team. Instead, it was a professionally taken, heart-wrenching photograph of a small, pale-faced girl in a hospital bed, her face lit with a genuine, rapturous smile, as a nurse read to her from a brightly colored picture book. The image was a masterpiece of emotional manipulation, and it instantly framed the story in a context of pure, unassailable virtue. I began to read the text. My goldsmith's eye, trained to appraise the quality and authenticity of fine things, now appraised the quality of the prose. It was effusive, glowing, a perfectly crafted piece of laudatory journalism. The article spoke of the extraordinary and humble generosity of Mark and Evelyn Brody, who had, in a quiet, private gesture, made one of the largest single donations in the hospital's history. It quoted the hospital's director at length, his words a cascade of superlatives describing the transformative impact the new Eleanor Brody Memorial Library would have on countless young lives. The narrative wove a beautiful story of two devoted children, successful in their own right, choosing to honor their beloved mother's memory not with a static monument, but with a living, breathing gift of literature and imagination for the sick and the vulnerable. My name was not mentioned once. I was a ghost in this story, the silent, invisible source, while my children were positioned as the selfless, beatific heroes. It was, in its own way, a work of art, a perfect, glittering, and utterly fraudulent fabrication. I sat back in my chair, the paper spread before me, and I allowed my imagination to do the rest. I was a craftsman who had just set his final, most intricate mechanism in motion, and now I could visualize its every turn and catch. I pictured my son, Mark, in his starkly modern minimalist house on the other side of the country. I saw him on his sun-drenched terrace, a tablet in his hand, scrolling through the digital version of this very paper. I saw his eyes finding the headline, his name linked to this impossible act of charity. I imagined the sharp, cold jolt of disbelief, the immediate panicked swiping of his finger as he checked his own bank accounts, the frantic search for a transaction that had never occurred. And then, I envisioned the beginning of the cascade. The chime of an incoming email on his tablet, the subject line from the chairman of his company's board reading, "Mark, just saw the news, incredibly proud." Then a text message buzzing on his phone from his biggest client. "Wow, class act. Let's talk Monday." I saw the trap springing shut around him. To deny it would be to invite suspicion, to appear unstable and bizarre in the very week his entire career was on the line. To accept it would be to live a lie, to take credit for a noble act he had not only not performed, but which had been funded by the very inheritance he had been scheming to acquire. Then my mind traveled south, to Evelyn's sprawling, perfectly decorated home. I saw her at brunch at her exclusive country club, the physical newspaper passed among her friends, their voices a chorus of delighted, envious praise. "Evelyn, darling, you are too modest. Why didn't you say anything? What a beautiful way to remember your mother." I saw her face, a perfect, practiced mask of humble smiles and gracious deflections. I saw her accepting the accolades, the social currency of her new elevated status as a major philanthropist, while inside, her mind would be a maelstrom of confusion and rising panic. She, who valued appearances above all else, was now trapped in the most beautiful appearance of all, a gilded cage of public adoration, built on a foundation of which she had no knowledge. I imagined her later, alone in her car, her smile finally falling, her mind racing, trying to reconcile the baffling anonymous delivery of a locket containing a dead flower with this sudden, inexplicable, and very public act of charity. The two events, so disparate in nature, would now be linked in their minds, two unsolvable puzzles that pointed to an unseen, omniscient manipulator. They would feel not just confused, but powerless, a sensation neither of them had ever been forced to endure. I folded the newspaper neatly and placed it on the corner of the table. My work was done. The public reckoning was now in motion, and it would proceed, with or without my attention, to its logical, inevitable conclusion. The days that followed the publication of the Sunday article were the quietest I had ever known. The world outside my windows continued its course, but within the walls of my home, a profound and final stillness had settled. I did not expect the phone to ring, and it did not. I did not expect a letter, and none arrived. This silence from my children was not the silence of neglect, as it had been before. It was the dense, heavy silence of checkmate, the silence of a player who has no more moves to make, and who cannot bring himself to concede the game. It was the most eloquent confession I could have ever hoped to receive. Their inability to contact me, to question, to rage, was the final, incontrovertible proof that my plan had worked exactly as designed. They were trapped, and their silence was the sound of the cage door locking behind them. My thoughts, no longer occupied with strategy and execution, turned to the second, quieter part of my maneuver: the lockets. The public reckoning had been a grand, sweeping gesture, but the lockets were the intimate, surgical strike, a message aimed not at their reputation, but at the barren space where their souls were supposed to be. I would sit in my workshop for hours, the tools of my trade lying untouched before me, and I would think about those two small golden objects, now 1,000 miles away, resting in the possession of people who could see them, but could not understand them. I pictured them again, not with the anticipatory imagination of my previous reflections, but with the cold, analytical eye of a craftsman examining a failed casting. I thought of Mark. I imagined him in his glass-walled office high above the city, the newspaper article about his generosity having become the talk of his firm. He would have endured the backslapping congratulations, the admiring emails, the quiet envy of his colleagues. He would have played the part of the humble philanthropist flawlessly because his survival depended on it. But I saw him later, at night, alone in that sterile, empty house of his. I saw him retrieving the velvet box from a drawer. I saw him opening the locket, no longer with confusion, but with a new and bitter comprehension. He would not see the symbol of his first honest earning. He would see a taunt. He would see the solid, tangible gold of the locket, a thing of measurable monetary worth. And he would see the worthless scrap of paper within it, and he would believe that he had been shown the container for a treasure that had then been stolen from him. In his mind, the vast sum of money from the donation and this empty, mocking locket would become linked. He would believe I had liquidated his mother's fortune and sent him this piece of sentimental trash as a final, cruel joke. The lesson of the first dollar, the lesson of pride, work, and the dignity of small beginnings would be utterly lost on him. He would only understand the cold, brutal arithmetic of a fortune gained and then lost, and his soul would be consumed by the phantom pain of an inheritance he felt was his by right. Then my thoughts would drift to Evelyn. I saw her in her perfectly appointed living room, surrounded by objects chosen for their beauty and their status. She, too, would be navigating the strange, disorienting currents of her new public persona. She would be accepting invitations to join new charity boards, smiling graciously at luncheons held in her honor, the celebrated and generous daughter of a beloved local woman. She would perform the role with the skill of a seasoned actress. But I saw her too, in the quiet moments, alone in her room, opening the velvet box. She would look at the dried forget-me-not, and she would feel not a nostalgic warmth, but a cold dread. The flower, which had at first been merely baffling, would now seem to her like a piece of the crude, unsophisticated past she had spent her entire adult life trying to escape. It was a symbol of a world of simple, unmonetized beauty, a world her mother had cherished and which she had rejected in favor of the polished, expensive, and ultimately empty world she now inhabited. The locket would feel like a judgment, the golden frame would be a cage, and the dead flower inside would be a portrait of her own withered heart. The phrase on the card, "The most valuable things have no price," would no longer be a quaint, sentimental puzzle. It would be a condemnation, a line drawn between her mother's world and her own, and she would know with a chilling certainty on which side of that line she stood. I had sent them a key, and they had seen only a strangely shaped piece of metal. I had sent them a map, and they had seen only a crumpled piece of paper. The final bitter truth of my experiment was this: I had succeeded in my strategy, but I had failed in my hope. I had hoped perhaps for a flicker of recognition, a dawning of understanding, a moment of painful but transformative insight. But I knew now that it would not come. Their values were not flawed. They were absent. There was nothing to appeal to. It was the final, dispassionate assessment a craftsman must sometimes make of his own material. It is beautiful on the surface, but there is a deep, unfixable flaw within, one that runs all the way through. The lesson had been delivered, but the students were incapable of learning. Late one evening, I took the original charcoal sketches that Eleanor and I had made for the lockets, the last remaining evidence of their conception, and I laid them in the cold fireplace. I struck a match and watched the paper curl, turn black, and dissolve into a whisper of gray ash. The design was complete. The project was over. The seasons turned, pulling the world through its familiar immutable cycle. The cold silence of winter had yielded to the tentative, green shoots of a new spring. I watched the change from the window of my workshop, the world outside my quiet house slowly reawakening. My own life had found a similar, settled rhythm, a quiet peace that was as profound and as welcome as the return of the sun's warmth. The great tumultuous storm of the previous year had passed, and the wreckage it had left behind had long since been cleared away, leaving a landscape that was scarred, but clean. The anger, the grief, the cold, sharp-edged need for justice, all these things had cooled and settled, like molten gold solidifying into its final, permanent shape. My days were simple, and I guarded their simplicity with a fierce, quiet devotion. I would rise with the sun, the habit of a lifetime, and begin my day, not with the news of the world, but with a slow walk through Eleanor's garden. I found I had inherited her love for the soil, for the patient, honest work of tending to living things. My hands, which for so long had known only the hard, unyielding nature of metal and stone, now learned the new language of soft earth, of delicate roots and thorny stems. I pruned the roses she had planted, my cuts precise, removing the dead wood to make way for the vibrant, new growth. I cultivated the patch of forget-me-nots in the corner by the stone wall, their blossoms a carpet of impossible, startling blue. In the garden, I felt a connection to her that was more real and more profound than any jewel could provide. It was a living, breathing memorial, and in caring for it, I was caring for the best part of my own memory of her. After my work in the garden, I would retreat to my workshop. The space was no longer an armory or an intelligence center. It had returned to its original purpose, a place of creation. For the first time in many years, I was not working on a commission, not creating an object to satisfy a client's desire for status or display. I was working for myself. I had acquired a single, flawless aquamarine, a stone the color of a pale winter sky. Over the long months, I had been designing and crafting a setting for it, a simple, elegant pendant of white gold. The work was slow, painstaking, and it was a source of immense, quiet joy. I found that my hands had not lost their skill, nor my eyes their sharpness. I would spend hours at my bench, the world outside disappearing, my entire being focused on the millimeter-precise movement of a file against metal, the gentle pressure required to seat the stone in its bezel. The piece was not for anyone. It had no destination. The act of its creation was its own purpose. It was a physical manifestation of my new life, a thing of simple, quiet beauty, made not for a price, but for the love of the craft itself. I had no contact with my children. Their world and mine no longer intersected, not even at the distant, tangential points of memory. They were like characters in a book I had read long ago, their stories concluded. One day, while waiting for an appointment, I saw a glossy society magazine left on a table. My idle fingers flipped through the pages of smiling, unfamiliar faces. And then I saw her. Evelyn. She was in a photograph from the Art Museum's annual benefit, the one she had been co-chairing. She was standing beside a local politician, a champagne flute in her hand, her smile a dazzling, perfect creation. The caption beneath the photo lauded her for her tireless charitable work, mentioning in passing the extraordinary gift she and her brother had made to the Children's Hospital. I looked at the photograph of this beautiful, successful, and celebrated stranger, and I felt absolutely nothing. There was no anger, no pain, no flicker of paternal pride or loss. It was like looking at a well-made but ultimately hollow piece of jewelry. I closed the magazine and set it aside. My life was defined now, not by what I had lost, but by what I had retained. I had my home, a quiet sanctuary filled with the warm, gentle ghosts of a happy marriage. I had my work, a craft that gave my days purpose and my hands a reason to move. And I had my integrity, a thing I valued more than any precious metal. The lesson I had set out to teach my children had been a failure, in a way. They had not learned the meaning of true value. but in the process of teaching, I had reaffirmed its meaning for myself. I had been forced to audit the ledgers of my own life and had found, in the final accounting, that my most significant assets, love, honor, memory, and skill, were all still there, untouched and untarnishable. One evening, as the last of the spring sun slanted through the workshop window, I completed my work on the aquamarine pendant. I gave it a final polish and held it up to the light. It was simple, clean, and perfect. It glowed with a soft internal fire, a quiet piece of captured sky. I did not place it in a box or a safe. I simply laid it on the velvet mat of my workbench. I cleaned my tools, swept the floor of the tiny gold filings, and turned off the light. I sat there for a moment in the gathering dark, the finished piece a pale gleam before me. The house was utterly silent. It was the silence of a life stripped down to its essentials, a life of profound and lasting peace. It was the peace of a goldsmith, alone in his workshop, having created a single perfect thing for no reason other than the fact that he could. And it was enough.